Federal Drive is presented by GEHA, Government Employees Health Association, proudly providing health and dental benefits to federal employees and their families. Visit GEHA.com.
6 months after launch, the Impact Project has grown in scope and added a security map that reveals patterns and threats against public servants. Abby Andre, the project's founding executive director, explains what the data shows and how it can guide action. Abby, it's lovely to have you back on the show.
Thanks so much for having me.
When we first spoke back in May, the Impact Project was just launching. So now that you're 6 months old, what have you learned since then about how people are using the tool and how the project has evolved?
We've learned a lot since we launched. When we started, we had about 5,000 instances of government change mapped on our impact map. And now we have over 250,000 individual instances of change. Not just to cross sectors, which is where we started, looking at the whole country and the whole host of changes we were seeing, but we've done some really deep dives into impacts in public health, AmeriCorps, Office and Budget, and most recently the security map. And we've been seeing a lot of journalists use the map, but increasingly we are talking to those who are really focused on the future, who really want to start thinking about how to respond to cuts and changes in federal policy in a way that can help restore services and start thinking about some creative ways to approach public service and government if the federal government is going to step back. So who now is going to step in?
So tell us about some of the trends that you're seeing now that you have so many data points.
I think the scope of impact is still the biggest one that we really hope folks looking at our maps will understand. Federal dollars are inherent to service delivery in every county across the country. Federal workers and public service live in every state and almost every county. And so these impacts have been felt everywhere.
And when you talked about public health and AmeriCorps, are there other projects or programs where you've seen specific impact?
So I've been struck by impacts in food in particular. So very early on, we saw a couple of COVID-era food programs cut. Local Food for Schools was one of them. And a lot of these gave farmers somewhere to send their fresh produce, and folks in need of food, either kids or folks who were strapped in their budget, ways to access that really fresh, healthy food. And we have seen kind of echoes of that throughout the year, stories about food banks being in short supply and pantries not being able to provide what they needed. And then the uncertainty that we had around SNAP benefits during the shutdown really heightened people's insecurity and concern about where they might be getting their next meal from.
And now that we're coming into the holiday season, any of those indicators flashing red for you?
Well, I remain extremely concerned about food access, particularly among our most vulnerable families. I also remain concerned about people's access to heating and cooling as we get into the colder months, while LIHEAP, the Low Income Energy Assistance Program, has not yet been fully cut. Many of the staff have been lost, and we've seen reports of interruption of services. And so I just continue to be really aware of the cumulative impact of cuts across sectors on families who rely on more than one type of government service, whether it's food and healthcare or food and energy and healthcare, right? If you see small cuts across those areas, it can have an outsized impact for those of us who are living paycheck to paycheck.
I'm speaking with Abby Andre. She's the founding executive director of the Impact Project. Abby, one of the newest features on the map is the security map. It's a big new addition. Tell us about what prompted you to create it and how it fills a gap in understanding the kinds of threats that public servants are facing.
Yeah. So I launched this map in partnership with the Public Service Alliance, which is led by Isa Ulloa. She's a former Fed. She worked at DHS. And she and I share a real value of public servants. Humanizing public servants was one of the original goals of the Impact Project, and her work at Public Service Alliance offers more affordable resources in security and privacy to make it safer for public servants to serve. And she and I came together and started talking last May about the threat landscape facing public servants, in addition to the other burdens that they're experiencing with the ecosystem of change. And we really agree that public service is patriotism and core to our country and our values. And so we wanted to build a tool that would help the American people understand who public servants are and why we should value them.
And as you look at the security threats, are there any trends that you see or things that surprise you?
Yeah, so this map is a little different than the Impact Project's other maps in that we looked at 10 years worth of stories. So we went back to try to get a sense for whether or not threats were increasing. So we importantly partnered with a couple of experts in the field, the Bridging Divides Initiative out of Princeton, Insight out of the University of Nebraska at Omaha, and their data all shows an uptick of threats over time using methodologies that are slightly different from our own. So we wanted to dig in and see if we saw something similar, and we did. So over time, we've observed an increase in threats overall across red and blue states, but also a real increase in threats at the local level. You know, I think many of us a decade ago, if you were asked about who got threatened for their work for the government, you would think about judges and elected officials, right? Now we know, and particularly since the beginning of the pandemic, that school board officials, librarians, city council members are really at the front line of this surge in threats that we're seeing nationwide.
The map draws on pretty sensitive data, court records, partner data sets. How do you ensure that this is accurate but also transparent when you're compiling such sensitive information?
That's a really important question. So we have to balance the desire to make the tool accessible and a source of education with our overarching need to keep public servants safe. So from our end, we only use publicly available records. So if something is in a newspaper article, we're willing to map it. But we do a couple of things to try and protect the identity of the people that we're talking about, even if the identity was in the newspaper article. So we scrub for names. We never include the name of a threatened person or a perpetrator for that matter. And we also don't geocode to a person's address or place of work. Instead, we geocode, which means how do we put the dot on the map? We put it in the zip code or the county so that you can still get a sense for the geographic spread of the threats, but the data set couldn't be used to find people.
Those threats to local public servants could have a real chilling effect on the future of public service writ large. We all rely on librarians and police officers and, school board officials to make our communities function. Are you seeing that kind of impact as you look at those trends?
We absolutely are. And it's one of the reasons we made the map. We're seeing that threatened people resign. We're speaking anecdotally to folks who are opting not to run for office, who feel called to serve but don't feel safe. And oftentimes these threats not only impact public servants, but their family members, their children. There was a story out of Minnesota that I found particularly moving about an individual who'd spent 4 separate rounds as a public school board official and resigned in the middle of his 5th tenure because the threats against himself and his office mates had become so severe. So we not only lose that person in his last term, but his institutional knowledge, right? So we worry a lot that the chilling effect at the local level in particular will drive people away from service. And PSA is one answer to that. But we hope overall that this map is a real call for more research, more common sense solutions, and a return to seeing public servants as what they are, and that's someone that really sacrifices for the good of the community and should be valued that way.
Abby, thank you so much for pulling all of this together. You mentioned a couple of actions there that you hope, or mindset shifts that you hope people engage in as they see this data. Are there policy actions or other sorts of specific steps you'd like to see communities and governments take?
Yeah, so we will be launching a new map in addition to this that is a little bit more forward-looking in the spring. And we're already thinking about the laws, whether it's privacy laws, criminal laws, or laws specifically tailored to things like doxing or swatting when someone's information is published online, a false call goes into the police, and somebody shows up at a public servant's house, right? We have not done a good job holistically across the board of taking steps to protect public servants in a tailored way. And so we hope that the coming map and the materials that go with it will help identify best practices and really elevate the need for lawmakers and communities to be having conversations about steps around privacy, security, and education that can help lower the temperature.
I've been speaking with Abby Andre. She's the founding executive director of the Impact Project. Abby, thanks so much for this update and for what you're continuing to do.
Thanks for having me, Terry.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts. Still to come, GAO says the Coast Guard's biggest shipbuilding program faces major design and cost risks.